The frost-kissed streets of St. Louis shimmered under a pale November sun as the city awakened to what would become its most bewildering mystery. November 14th, 1930, a Friday that began like any other during those desperate Depression years, when hope was as scarce as steady employment and trust in financial institutions hung by a thread thinner than spider silk. At precisely 6:47 a.m., the temperature gauge outside Brennan's hardware store read 28 degrees Fahrenheit. A bitter wind swept down from the Missouri River, carrying with it the acrid scent of coal smoke from the residential districts and the distant rumble of freight trains that no longer ran on schedule. The cobblestone streets glistened with a thin layer of ice that would prove treacherous for both pedestrians and the handful of automobiles that still puttered through the city's arteries. The Grand National Bank stood like a granite sentinel at the corner of Chestnut and 7th Street, its imposing facade a testament to an era of prosperity that now seemed as distant as a half-remembered dream. Built in 1887 with Indiana limestone and adorned with intricate carved eagles that gazed down upon the struggling masses, the bank had weathered 43 years of economic storms, but none quite like this one. Inside the bank's mahogany-paneled walls, the morning routine began with the mechanical precision of a Swiss timepiece. Thaddeus Cromwell, the 62-year-old head teller, arrived at exactly 7:15 a.m., as he had every working day for the past 17 years. His weathered hands, marked by decades of counting currency and stamping documents, trembled slightly as he inserted his key into the employee entrance. The tremor wasn't from the cold. It was from the flask of bootleg whiskey he kept hidden in his coat pocket, a small comfort that helped him sleep through the nightmares that had plagued him since the market crash 13 months earlier. Cromwell's salt and pepper mustache was meticulously waxed, his charcoal vest pressed to perfection, and his wire-rimmed spectacles polished to a shine. To any observer he appeared the picture of reliability and institutional trustworthiness. But beneath that carefully maintained exterior lurked a man drowning in debt, haunted by poor investments, and harboring secrets that would soon make him the prime suspect in the most audacious crime in St. Louis history. The bank's interior was a cathedral of capitalism, with soaring ceilings supported by marble columns imported from Italy. Gas-powered chandeliers cast dancing shadows across the polished floor, where the footsteps of customers echoed like whispers in a tomb. Behind the ornate bronze teller windows, a fortress-like vault waited in the basement, protected by a Musler Safe Company time lock mechanism that was considered impregnable. At 7:30 a.m., Evangeline Ashworth glided through the bank's front doors with the grace of someone born to wealth, but cursed with a conscience. The 26-year-old daughter of the bank's president had inherited her mother's striking auburn hair and her father's steely determination, but possessed something neither of her parents had ever demonstrated: genuine empathy for the common people whose life savings were entrusted to their institution. Evangeline served as the bank's customer relations specialist, a position her father had created to keep her occupied and out of what he considered more serious business matters. But she took her role seriously, often staying late to help widows understand their husbands' accounts, or working weekends to find solutions for farmers facing foreclosure. Her colleagues whispered that she was too soft-hearted for the banking business, but none dared voice such opinions within earshot of her father. This particular morning, Evangeline wore a navy blue wool dress with pearl buttons, and her usually immaculate appearance showed subtle signs of distress. Her emerald eyes, normally bright with determination, were shadowed with dark circles that spoke of sleepless nights. In her leather satchel she carried a letter that had arrived 3 days earlier, a letter that would prove crucial to understanding the events about to unfold. The bank's president, Cornelius Ashworth, was a man who commanded respect through fear, rather than admiration. At 58, he stood 6 feet tall with shoulders broad enough to bear the weight of his ambitions and a conscience apparently flexible enough to bend around questionable business practices. His steel-gray hair was slicked back with pomade, and his mustache was waxed to sharp points that seemed to mirror the coldness in his pale blue eyes. Ashworth had built his fortune through a combination of shrewd investments, political connections, and a willingness to foreclose on properties when other banks might show mercy. During the past year, as the Depression tightened its grip on St. Louis, he had acquired 17 family homes, 3 farms, and 2 small businesses through foreclosure proceedings. His motto, embroidered on a pillow in his office, read, "Sentiment is the enemy of success." But Cornelius Ashworth harbored his own secrets, and on this gray November morning, those secrets weighed heavily on his mind. In his locked desk drawer lay documents that could destroy not only his reputation, but potentially send him to federal prison. He had been cooking the books for months, using depositor funds to cover his own gambling debts and failed investments. The upcoming state banking inspection, scheduled for the following Monday, would expose everything unless he could somehow replace the missing funds. At 8:15 a.m., as the bank prepared to open its doors to the public, a curious character made his first appearance in what would become a legendary mystery. Jasper Moldenhauer was a traveling clock repairman who had arrived in St. Louis 3 weeks earlier, claiming to be following a circuit that took him through small Midwestern cities. He was a slight man in his early 40s, with thinning brown hair and nervous habits that included constantly adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses and checking the pocket watch that hung from his vest. Moldenhauer had approached the bank 2 days earlier, offering to service their large grandfather clock that stood in the main lobby, a timepiece that had been running slow for months. Evangeline had approved the work, seeing no harm in the small expenditure, despite her father's general prohibition on unnecessary expenses. What no one knew was that Moldenhauer's expertise extended far beyond clockwork mechanisms, and his nervous demeanor concealed a brilliant criminal mind that had been planning this operation for over a year. The clock repairman's real name was Jerome Patterson, and he was a former employee of the Mosler Safe Company. 5 years earlier, he had been dismissed from his position for allegedly stealing blueprints, though the charges were never proven in court. Since then, he had drifted from city to city, studying banks, learning their routines, and waiting for the perfect opportunity. The Grand National Bank, with its aging security measures and predictable staff schedules, had caught his attention during his previous visit to St. Louis in. As the morning progressed, other key players in this unfolding drama took their positions like actors preparing for a performance they didn't know they were about to give. Detective Raymond Kessler of the St. Louis Metropolitan Police Department was conducting his routine patrol of the financial district, unaware that this would be the case that would define his career and ultimately drive him to an early grave. Kessler was 34 years old, a veteran of the Great War, who had seen enough death and destruction to last several lifetimes. He walked with a slight limp, courtesy of German shrapnel that had torn through his left leg during the Battle of Belleau Wood. His dark hair was prematurely gray at the temples, and his brown eyes held the weary look of a man who had lost his faith in human nature but continued fighting for justice out of habit rather than hope. The detective had been tracking a series of unusual incidents around the financial district for the past month. Small thefts, suspicious characters asking detailed questions about bank procedures, and reports of individuals conducting surveillance on various financial institutions. His superiors had dismissed these concerns as the paranoid imaginings of a shell-shocked veteran, but Kessler's instincts told him something significant was brewing. At 8:45 a.m., 15 minutes before the bank was scheduled to open, a black Packard sedan pulled up at the curb across the street from the Grand National Bank. 3 men sat inside, their faces obscured by the shadows cast by their fedora hats. The driver kept the engine running while his companions studied the bank's exterior with the focused intensity of predators watching their prey. The man in the passenger seat was known in certain criminal circles as the Professor, a title earned through his meticulous planning and intellectual approach to heists. His real name was Edmund Kavanaugh, and he had spent the better part of 2 decades perfecting the art of bank robbery. Unlike the crude smash-and-grab tactics employed by most Depression-era criminals, Kavanaugh believed in preparation, patience, and precision. Kavanaugh was 46 years old, with prematurely white hair and the refined mannerisms of an educated gentleman. He spoke 4 languages, held a master's degree in engineering from Columbia University, and had once been employed by the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. His fall from grace had begun with a gambling addiction that led to embezzlement, followed by a prison sentence that introduced him to a criminal underworld, where his skills were highly valued. The man seated behind the driver was Kavanaugh's muscle, a 6'4" giant named Otto Steinberg, who had earned his reputation in the bare-knuckle boxing rings of Chicago before discovering that robbery paid better than fighting. Steinberg's massive hands could crush a man's windpipe or crack a safe with equal efficiency, and his cold blue eyes showed no trace of the fear or excitement that might betray an amateur criminal. The third member of the team, serving as the driver, was perhaps the most dangerous of all. Felix Torino was a 28-year-old former race car driver who had turned to crime after a crash ended his professional career. His reflexes were lightning fast. His knowledge of St. Louis streets was encyclopedic, and his ability to navigate high-pressure situations while maintaining ice-cold composure made him invaluable to the operation. At exactly 9:00 a.m., Evangeline Ashworth unlocked the bank's front doors and flipped the sign from closed to open. The morning light streamed through the tall windows, illuminating the dust motes that danced in the air like tiny spirits. She had no way of knowing that she had just started the countdown to one of the most audacious crimes in American banking history. The first customers of the day were typical of those who visited the bank during these difficult times. Mrs. Hazel Fitzpatrick, a 70-year-old widow, arrived to withdraw $5 from her dwindling savings account, money she needed to buy medicine for her arthritis. Behind her stood Benjamin Kowalski, a Polish immigrant who worked at the brewery and came to deposit his weekly wages of $8.50, money that represented hope for a better future for his 3 young children. These were the faces of Depression-era America, people struggling to maintain their dignity while the economic foundations of their world crumbled around them. They trusted institutions like the Grand National Bank to safeguard their modest wealth, never imagining that forces were already in motion that would shake that trust to its very core. At 9:30 a.m., Jasper Moldenhauer, the man who was actually Jerome Patterson, arrived at the bank carrying his leather tool case and wearing the expression of a craftsman ready to begin an honest day's work. He nodded politely to Evangeline, who greeted him with the warm smile she reserved for people she believed were simply trying to make an honest living. "Good morning, Mr. Moldenhauer," she said, her voice carrying the cultured tones of her expensive education. "The clock is right where you left it yesterday. I do hope you will be able to get it running properly again." "Oh, I'm quite confident I can fix whatever's wrong with it, Miss Ashworth," Patterson replied, his voice carefully modulated to sound humble and unthreatening. "These old timepieces just need someone who understands their particular quirks." As Patterson made his way to the grandfather clock in the lobby, he noted the positions of the tellers, the location of the security guard, and the sightlines from various vantage points throughout the bank. His trained eye catalogued every detail that might prove useful in the operation planned for exactly 10:47 a.m., a time he had calculated would provide optimal conditions for success. The clock itself was a magnificent piece, standing nearly 8 feet tall and crafted from rich walnut wood. Its brass pendulum swung with hypnotic regularity, and its Westminster chimes had marked the hours for the bank's customers for over 2 decades. But today, this innocent timepiece would serve as camouflage for one of the most sophisticated criminal operations ever attempted in the American Midwest. Patterson opened his toolcase and began his charade of repairing the clock, while actually making subtle modifications that would serve his true purpose. Hidden among his legitimate repair tools were small mirrors that he positioned to provide a clear view of the teller area, and a compact signaling device that would allow him to communicate with his confederates outside. At 10:15 a.m., Detective Kessler paused in front of the bank during his routine patrol. Something felt wrong, though he couldn't immediately identify what had triggered his instinct for danger. The morning seemed too quiet, too ordinary. In his experience, criminals often struck when everything appeared most normal, using the facade of routine to mask their true intentions. Kessler studied the few pedestrians on the street, the parked automobiles, and the patterns of movement around the bank. His war-trained senses detected subtle anomalies: a man in a overcoat who had been standing across the street for too long, the black Packard that had been parked in the same spot for over an hour, and the general feeling that he was watching a stage production rather than observing real life. But without concrete evidence of criminal activity, Kessler could do nothing except make a mental note to increase his vigilance. He continued his patrol, unaware that his timing would prove crucial to the events about to unfold. Inside the bank, the morning routine continued with deceptive normalcy. Thaddeus Cromwell processed deposits and withdrawals with mechanical efficiency, his trembling hands steadied by the alcohol in his system and the desperate hope that somehow his financial problems would resolve themselves. Evangeline assisted customers with practiced grace, while mentally rehearsing the difficult conversation she would need to have with her father about the contents of the letter hidden in her satchel. Cornelius Ashworth remained in his office, frantically reviewing financial documents and calculating whether there was any way to cover his embezzlement before Monday's inspection. The stress had given him a persistent headache, and his usually impeccable appearance showed signs of strain. His collar was slightly wrinkled, his hair less perfectly arranged than usual. At exactly 10:47 a.m., as Patterson had calculated, the conditions were perfect. The morning rush of customers had subsided, leaving only 3 people in the lobby. The security guard, an elderly man named Murphy who was more ceremonial than functional, was dozing in his chair near the entrance. The tellers were busy with paperwork, and Evangeline was in the back office discussing account details with a customer. Patterson glanced at the small mirror he had positioned on the clock case and saw the prearranged signal from across the street: a man in a grey overcoat adjusting his hat twice in quick succession. The operation was a go. The clock repairman reached into his tool case and withdrew what appeared to be a small brass instrument, but which was actually a highly sophisticated locking mechanism pick. With movements so subtle they were nearly invisible, he began working on the employee access door that led to the vault area, a door he had studied extensively during his previous day's reconnaissance. At 10:49 a.m., 3 men in dark overcoats and fedora hats entered the Grand National Bank through the front door. They moved with the casual confidence of ordinary customers, but Detective Kessler, who happened to be looking through the window from across the street, immediately recognized something predatory in their posture and movement. The 3 men, Kavanaugh, Steinberg, and Torino, had rehearsed this moment dozens of times. They knew exactly where each employee would be positioned, how long it would take to reach the vault, and what their escape route would be. They also knew that success depended entirely on speed, precision, and the element of surprise. Kavanaugh approached the main teller window, where Cromwell was counting currency. With a voice that was calm but carried an unmistakable edge of menace, he said, "Good morning. I believe you have something that belongs to us." The words seemed innocent enough to any casual observer, but Cromwell immediately understood their true meaning when he saw the outline of a pistol beneath Kavanaugh's overcoat. The old teller's face drained of color, and his hands began to shake more violently than usual. "Please," Cromwell whispered, his voice barely audible, "I have grandchildren, and you will live to see them again if you follow instructions exactly." Kavanaugh replied, his tone remaining conversationally pleasant while his eyes conveyed absolute seriousness. "We are not here to hurt anyone. We are simply here to make a withdrawal." Meanwhile, Steinberg had positioned himself near the security guard, who was just beginning to stir from his doze. With movements that were swift but appeared casual, the giant criminal placed a hand on Murphy's shoulder and applied just enough pressure to communicate that resistance would be futile. Torino took up position near the front door, casually flipping the door sign from open to closed and positioning himself to watch for any unexpected visitors or police patrol cars. His hand rested inside his coat pocket, where he carried a .38 caliber revolver and had a clear view of the entire lobby. At the grandfather clock, Patterson had successfully picked the employee access lock and was now making his way toward the vault area. His clock repair charade had provided him with detailed knowledge of the bank's layout, including the location of alarm systems and the timing of security procedures. The three customers in the lobby, Mrs. Fitzpatrick, Benjamin Kowalski, and a well-dressed businessman named Harrison Mitchell, suddenly found themselves unwilling participants in a drama they didn't yet fully comprehend. The atmosphere in the bank had shifted subtly but unmistakably, like the moment before a thunderstorm when the air becomes charged with electricity. Evangeline emerged from the back office at exactly the wrong moment. Her customer service instincts prompted her to smile and approach the three newcomers, but something in their posture made her pause. She had dealt with desperate people before. Farmers facing foreclosure, widows worried about their savings, businessmen struggling to keep their companies afloat. But this was different. These men radiated a cold professionalism that chilled her to the bone. "May I help you, gentlemen?" she asked, her voice steady despite the growing knot of fear in her stomach. "Everything is under control, miss," Kavanaugh replied with a smile that never reached his eyes. "We are just conducting some business with Mr. Cromwell." It was then that Evangeline noticed the old teller's condition. Cromwell appeared to be on the verge of collapse, his face pale and sweaty, his hands trembling as he slowly opened his cash drawer. The realization hit her like a physical blow. The bank was being robbed. Outside, Detective Kessler had decided to investigate his nagging sense of unease. He crossed the street and approached the bank's front windows, where he could see through the glass doors into the lobby. What he observed confirmed his worst fears. The body language of everyone inside suggested a situation that was not routine customer service. The detective's hand moved instinctively to his service revolver as he considered his options. Bursting through the front door could trigger violence that might result in innocent casualties, but waiting for backup might allow the criminals to escape or escalate the situation beyond control. Kessler made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He moved to a position where he could observe the bank while remaining hidden, and began counting the number of criminals and innocent bystanders, trying to calculate the best moment to intervene. Inside the vault area, Patterson was demonstrating why he had been considered one of the most skilled safe technicians in the country. The Mosler time lock system that protected the Grand National Bank's main vault was indeed sophisticated, but Patterson knew its weaknesses intimately. He had spent months studying the blueprints he had stolen years earlier, and he understood exactly how to bypass the timing mechanism. Working with tools hidden in his clock repair kit, Patterson began the delicate process of defeating the vault's defenses. The time lock was designed to prevent access except during specific hours, but Patterson knew that every security system had vulnerabilities for those with sufficient knowledge and patience. Back in the lobby, the tension was building toward a breaking point. Cromwell had emptied his cash drawer and was now being directed toward the vault area, where the bank's real wealth was stored. The old teller moved like a man walking to his execution, each step an enormous effort of will. "Please," Mrs. Fitzpatrick whispered to Steinberg, who stood near her chair. "I just came to get medicine money for my arthritis." The giant criminal looked down at the elderly woman with something that might have been sympathy, but his voice remained cold when he replied, "Just stay quiet and still, ma'am. This will all be over soon." Evangeline found herself in an impossible situation. As the daughter of the bank's president, she felt responsible for the safety of everyone in the building, but she also knew that any attempt at heroics could result in tragedy. The letter in her satchel, the one that contained information that could destroy her father's reputation, suddenly seemed insignificant compared to the immediate danger facing innocent people. At 10:53 a.m., Cornelius Ashworth emerged from his office, having heard unusual sounds from the main lobby. The sight that greeted him was every banker's nightmare: armed criminals controlling his institution while innocent customers cowered in fear. His immediate instinct was to protect his reputation and his money, But when he saw his daughter among the potential victims, his priorities shifted dramatically. "Take whatever you want," Ashworth said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to command. "Just don't hurt anyone." Kavanaugh studied the bank president with the calculating gaze of a predator, evaluating potential threats. How refreshing to meet a reasonable businessman. "You must be Mr. Ashworth. We have heard a great deal about you." There was something in the criminal's tone that suggested knowledge beyond what any ordinary bank robber should possess. Ashworth felt a chill that had nothing to do with the November weather, as he wondered exactly what these men might know about his recent activities. In the vault area, Patterson had achieved the impossible. He had successfully bypassed the Mosler time lock system and gained access to the bank's main storage area. What he found inside exceeded even his most optimistic projections. The vault contained not only the bank's normal cash reserves, but also a substantial collection of bearer bonds, gold certificates, and other negotiable securities. But Patterson also discovered something unexpected: evidence that someone had been systematically looting the vault's contents for months. Cash bundles were missing, bond certificates had been replaced with worthless papers, and the gold reserves were significantly below what the bank's official records indicated they should be. The clock repairman found himself in the peculiar position of being a thief who had discovered that someone else had been stealing from the same target. The implications were staggering. Either bank employees were involved in long-term embezzlement, or another criminal organization had been systematically plundering the Grand National Bank. As Patterson loaded the remaining valuables into specially designed bags hidden in his tool case, he made mental notes about the evidence of prior theft. This information might prove valuable for future blackmail opportunities, assuming he survived the current operation. At 10:58 a.m., Detective Kessler made his move. He had observed the situation long enough to understand the basic dynamics. 3 armed criminals controlling approximately 6 innocent victims, with at least one additional perpetrator somewhere inside the building. His war experience had taught him that sometimes the best strategy was direct action, even when the odds were unfavorable. Kessler approached the bank's side entrance, a door typically used only by employees but which he knew would be unlocked during business hours. His plan was to enter the building quietly and attempt to position himself for a surprise attack on the criminals. But the detective had underestimated the sophistication of his opponents. Torino had positioned mirrors to provide sightlines to all approaches to the bank, and he spotted Kessler's movement immediately. Without appearing to alter his relaxed posture, the criminal reached into his coat and prepared to signal his confederates. The stage was set for a confrontation that would transform a routine bank robbery into a legendary mystery. In the vault, Patterson was making discoveries that suggested the Grand National Bank was harboring secrets far more dangerous than anyone imagined. In the lobby, innocent people were trapped between desperate criminals and a justice system that seemed powerless to protect them. And in 60 seconds, everything would change forever. The grandfather clock in the lobby chimed 11 times, its Westminster melody echoing through the marble halls like a funeral dirge. But the timepiece was no longer simply marking the hours. It had become the centerpiece of an operation that would baffle investigators for nearly a century. As the final chime faded into silence, Detective Kessler reached for the side door handle, completely unaware that he was about to step into a trap that had been carefully prepared by some of the most sophisticated criminals in American history. The mystery of the Grand National Bank robbery was about to begin, and when it ended, nothing would ever be the same again. Detective Raymond Kessler's hand closed around the cold brass handle of the employee entrance, just as Torino's mirror caught the reflection of movement. The criminal's fingers tightened imperceptibly around the grip of his concealed revolver, but instead of immediately alerting his partners, he made a calculation that would prove to be the first thread in an increasingly complex web of deception. Torino allowed Kessler to enter. The side door opened with barely a whisper, and the detective found himself in a narrow hallway that connected the main lobby to the bank's administrative offices. The muffled sounds of conversation from the lobby reached his ears, but something was wrong with the tone. Too controlled, too measured for normal banking business. Kessler drew his service weapon and began moving toward the main area with the practiced stealth of a man who had survived trench warfare. What the detective couldn't know was that his entry had been anticipated, planned for, and was now being manipulated by criminals whose sophistication exceeded anything he had encountered in his law enforcement career. Kavanaugh had spent months studying the response patterns of the Philly Metropolitan Police Department, and he knew that Detective Kessler's war-honed instincts would lead him to attempt exactly this type of flanking maneuver. In the vault, Patterson had made a discovery that changed everything. Hidden behind a false panel that even he had nearly missed, he found a leather portfolio containing documents that revealed the true scope of the corruption infecting the Grand National Bank. The papers detailed a conspiracy involving not just Cornelius Ashworth's embezzlement, but a sophisticated money laundering operation that connected the bank to organized crime syndicates operating throughout the Midwest. The portfolio contained names, dates, and financial transactions that painted a picture of institutional corruption, reaching far beyond simple theft. Mayor Vincent Gallagher's signature appeared on several documents, along with those of Police Commissioner Harold Brennan and Federal Banking Inspector Thomas Whitman. The Grand National Bank wasn't just being robbed today, it had been functioning as a criminal enterprise for over 2 years. Patterson's hands trembled as he photographed each document with a small camera hidden in his repair kit. This information was worth far more than the cash and securities he had come to steal. It was blackmail material that could keep him wealthy for the rest of his life, assuming he survived long enough to use it. But as he worked, Patterson became aware of a presence behind him. He turned to find Cornelius Ashworth standing in the vault entrance, his face a mask of barely controlled panic. The bank president had followed them down here, but not to protect his institution's assets. He had come to ensure that certain documents were never discovered. "Step away from that portfolio," Ashworth commanded, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to obedience. But there was desperation beneath the authority, the sound of someone whose carefully constructed world was collapsing around him. Patterson studied the banker with new understanding. "You are not here to stop a robbery," he said quietly. "You are here to cover up a crime that's been going on for years." "You have no idea what you are dealing with," Ashworth replied, his hand moving toward a desk drawer where he kept a small pistol. "That portfolio contains information that could destroy dozens of lives, including innocent people who had nothing to do with our arrangements." The confrontation in the vault was interrupted by a sound that sent ice through both men's veins, the unmistakable crack of gunfire from the lobby above. Someone had started shooting, and in that moment, both the banker and the thief realized that their carefully laid plans were about to spiral completely out of control. In the lobby, Detective Kessler had emerged from the hallway with his weapon drawn, expecting to find a standard robbery in progress. Instead, he discovered a scene that defied his understanding of criminal behavior. The 3 armed men were positioned exactly where they should be for maximum control, but their body language suggested they were waiting for something rather than actively conducting a heist. Evangeline Ashworth stood near the teller windows, but she wasn't cowering in fear like the other customers. Instead, she appeared to be engaged in what looked like a business discussion with Kavanaugh. The old security guard Murphy was awake and alert, but he wasn't showing any signs of distress. Most puzzling of all, Thaddeus Cromwell was methodically counting currency at his station, as if processing a routine transaction. "Police, everyone on the ground," Kessler shouted, his weapon trained on Kavanaugh. The reaction to his command revealed the true complexity of the situation. Instead of immediate compliance or defiant resistance, there was a moment of hesitation that suggested the participants were uncertain about their roles in this drama. Kavanaugh looked toward Evangeline with an expression that seemed to be seeking permission rather than showing criminal determination. It was Mrs. Hazel Fitzpatrick who broke the tableau by doing something completely unexpected. She began to laugh. The elderly widow's laughter was high and musical, but there was an edge of hysteria that made it deeply unsettling. "Oh, detective," she said, her voice carrying an accent that hadn't been present during her earlier conversation about arthritis medicine. "You really have no idea what's actually happening here, do you?" Kessler felt the world shift beneath his feet as he realized that nothing about this situation was what it appeared to be. The woman he had taken for an innocent victim was clearly something else entirely, and her transformation suggested that everyone in the bank might be playing roles rather than reacting authentically to a crisis. The gunshot that had been heard in the vault came not from any of the obvious participants, but from Benjamin Kowalski, the Polish brewery worker who had been standing quietly near the deposit window. His shot hadn't been aimed at anyone in particular. Instead, it had been fired into the ceiling, apparently as some sort of signal. "Phase 2, Kowalski announced in a voice that carried no trace of the immigrant accent he had displayed earlier. "Execute Phase 2. What happened next would be debated by investigators for decades. The three men who had appeared to be conducting the robbery, Kavanaugh, Steinberg, and Torino, suddenly became defenders of the bank rather than attackers. They turned their weapons toward the customers who had seemed to be innocent victims, revealing that the true criminals had been hiding in plain sight. Detective Kessler found himself caught in the middle of a situation that violated every assumption he had made about criminal behavior. The people he had come to rescue were actually the perpetrators, while the apparent robbers were, what? Security personnel? Undercover agents? The confusion was so complete that he hesitated to fire his weapon for fear of shooting the wrong person. "Detective Kessler," Evangeline said, her voice now carrying an authority that matched her father's. "I believe it's time you understood what's really happening at the Grand National Bank." She reached into her satchel and withdrew the letter that had been troubling her for days. But instead of handing it to him, she tore it in half and dropped the pieces on the marble floor. "That was evidence of my father's embezzlement," she said calmly. "Evidence that I have decided the world doesn't need to see." The revelation hit Kessler like a physical blow. Evangeline Ashworth wasn't an innocent victim caught in a robbery. She was an active participant in a cover-up operation designed to protect her father and the bank's criminal enterprise. The letter she had just destroyed might have been the only concrete proof of the corruption that had been festering within the institution. But the complexities of the situation were only beginning to unfold. Kavanaugh stepped forward, and when he spoke, his voice carried the crisp tones of law enforcement rather than criminal enterprise. "Detective, I'm Federal Agent Edmund Morrison, with the Treasury Department's Investigative Division. We have been conducting an undercover operation here for the past 6 weeks. He reached inside his coat and produced credentials that appeared authentic. Though in the chaos of the moment, Kessler had no way to verify their legitimacy. The individuals you assumed were innocent customers are actually members of a sophisticated criminal organization that has been systematically looting banks throughout the Midwest. The world had turned completely upside down. The robbers were federal agents, the victims were criminals, and the bank itself was apparently the center of a corruption investigation that reached into the highest levels of city government. Kessler felt his grip on reality slipping as he tried to process information that contradicted everything he thought he knew about the situation. In the vault, Patterson and Cornelius Ashworth were engaged in their own revelation-filled confrontation. The bank president had drawn his pistol, but instead of pointing it at the supposed clock repairman, he was aiming it at his own temple. "You don't understand," Ashworth said, his voice breaking with desperation. "If that portfolio becomes public, it won't just destroy me. It will bring down half the city government and expose operations that go all the way to Chicago and Kansas City. There are people involved in this who will kill anyone who threatens their security." Patterson studied the broken man before him, with something approaching sympathy. "Mr. Ashworth, I'm not who you think I am. My name is Jerome Patterson, and I work for the Federal Bureau of Investigation. We have been tracking this money laundering operation for over a year." The revelation that the clock repairman was also a federal agent sent Ashworth into complete psychological collapse. He lowered the pistol and sank into a chair, his face gray with the realization that his criminal empire had been infiltrated at every level. The clock repair was legitimate. Patterson continued. I really am a qualified timepiece technician, but I'm also a federal investigator who specializes in financial crimes. We have been building a case against your organization that will result in indictments reaching from St. Louis to Washington, D.C. But even as Patterson spoke, he was becoming aware that something was still not right about the situation. The documents in the portfolio were too convenient, too perfectly organized. Real criminal enterprises didn't typically maintain such detailed records of their illegal activities. It was almost as if someone had prepared this evidence specifically to be discovered. Back in the lobby, Detective Kessler was struggling to maintain his sanity as the layers of deception continued to unfold. Agent Morrison, the man he had known as Kavanaugh, was explaining that the entire morning had been an elaborate sting operation designed to force the criminal organization into revealing itself. The individuals posing as Mrs. Fitzpatrick, Mr. Kowalski, and Mr. Mitchell, Morrison explained, are members of a gang that has been responsible for over 30 bank robberies across 7 states. They use the technique of posing as innocent customers to case potential targets and identify security weaknesses. But Mrs. Fitzpatrick was laughing again, and her laughter carried a note that suggested Morrison's explanation was incomplete. "Oh, Agent Morrison," she said, her voice now carrying the educated tones of someone with extensive formal training. "You really think you understand what's happening here?" She stood and removed what had been an elaborate disguise, a gray wig, padding that had created the appearance of age and frailty, and makeup that had added decades to her appearance. Underneath was a woman in her 30s, with sharp intelligence in her eyes, and the bearing of someone accustomed to command. "My name is Dr. Victoria Harrington," she announced. "I'm a psychiatrist specializing in criminal behavior, and I have been conducting an authorized study of police response patterns during high-stress situations." The announcement sent shockwaves through everyone present. The supposed criminal was actually a researcher. The federal agents might or might not be legitimate, and the entire situation was apparently some sort of psychological experiment. Detective Kessler felt his worldview crumbling as he realized that he had no idea who was telling the truth or what was actually happening. But Dr. Harrington wasn't finished with her revelations. "What none of you understand," she continued, "is that this entire scenario, the robbery, the investigation, even the psychological study, is actually a cover for something much more significant." She walked to the grandfather clock and pressed a hidden mechanism that Patterson had missed during his reconnaissance. A panel slid open in the clock's base, revealing a sophisticated radio communication device. This bank has been serving as a communication hub for a network of federal agents investigating organized crime throughout the Midwest. The apparent corruption you have all discovered is actually carefully constructed misinformation designed to protect the real investigation. The revelation sent everyone in the room into stunned silence. The bank robbery was fake, the corruption was fabricated, and the entire morning had been an elaborate performance designed to test response protocols and communication systems. At exactly 11:15 a.m., as Dr. Harrington was explaining the true nature of the operation, something happened that no one had anticipated. The lights in the bank went out. The power failure was not part of any planned scenario. In the sudden darkness, the carefully orchestrated performance devolved into chaos as participants tried to determine whether this was another layer of deception or a genuine emergency. Emergency lighting activated after a few seconds, casting eerie shadows throughout the marble lobby. But when the emergency lights revealed the scene, everyone present realized that something impossible had occurred. During the few seconds of complete darkness, several people had vanished. Agent Morrison was gone. The man claiming to be Patterson had disappeared from the vault. Even Dr. Harrington, who had been standing directly in front of the grandfather clock, was nowhere to be seen. Detective Kessler found himself alone with Cornelius Ashworth, Evangeline, Thaddeus Cromwell, and the security guard Murphy. The individuals who had been revealing layers of deception and hidden identities had simply evaporated. Where did they go? Evangeline whispered, her voice carrying genuine fear for the first time that morning. Kessler approached the grandfather clock where Dr. Harrington had been standing. The hidden panel she had opened was now closed, and when he tried to activate the mechanism she had used, nothing happened. It was as if the secret compartment had never existed. In the vault, the leather portfolio containing the corruption evidence was missing. The safe showed no signs of forced entry beyond Patterson's original work, but every document that might have provided answers to the morning's mysteries had vanished along with the people who had claimed to be federal agents. Murphy, the elderly security guard, was the first to speak into the stunned silence. In 40 years of working bank security, he said slowly, I have never seen anything like this. But when Kessler looked more closely at Murphy, he noticed something that chilled him to the bone. The old man's eyes were completely different from what they had been earlier in the morning. Instead of the watery, unfocused gaze of an elderly retiree, Murphy's eyes were sharp, alert, and calculating. Who are you really? Kessler demanded, his weapon once again drawn. Murphy smiled, and when he spoke, his voice carried traces of an accent that might have been German or Austrian. Detective, I am exactly who I appear to be, a security guard who has been protecting this bank for many years. The question you should be asking is not who I am, but what I have been protecting it from. The old man walked to a section of the marble wall that looked identical to every other section, but when he pressed his hand against a specific spot, another hidden panel opened. Inside was a collection of photographs, documents, and what appeared to be surveillance equipment. The Grand National Bank, Murphy explained, has been serving as a front for United States intelligence operations since 1923. What you witnessed this morning was not a robbery, not a psychological experiment, and not a corruption investigation. It was a test of a new type of espionage protocol. The photographs showed scenes from inside the bank, taken over a period of months, with different individuals who had appeared to be customers or employees. Some of the faces Kessler recognized from the morning's events, but others were completely unfamiliar. The people who disappeared, Murphy continued, were operatives whose covers had been compromised. The power failure was a signal for emergency extraction. By now, they are probably halfway to Chicago under completely new identities. Kessler studied the photographs and documents, trying to make sense of a situation that seemed to grow more complex with each revelation. But one photograph caught his attention. It showed him entering the bank that morning, taken from an angle that suggested surveillance equipment hidden in the building's architecture. You have been watching me, he said quietly. Detective, we have been watching everyone, Murphy replied. Your involvement this morning was not accidental. You were selected specifically because of your military background and your reputation for discretion. The implications were staggering. Kessler realized that his decision to investigate the bank had not been based on instinct or observation. He had been guided into the situation by intelligence operatives who needed a credible law enforcement witness for their extraction operation. Evangeline, who had been silent during Murphy's revelations, finally spoke. My father's embezzlement was real, wasn't it? Murphy nodded gravely. Unfortunately, yes. Mr. Ashworth's criminal activities provided perfect cover for our intelligence operations, but they were also genuine crimes that needed to be addressed. Cornelius Ashworth, who had been brought up from the vault area, listened to these revelations with the expression of a man watching his life crumble into dust. So, you used my crimes to hide your spy games? More accurately, Murphy replied, your crimes provided us with leverage to ensure your cooperation when we needed to use your bank for national security purposes. The grandfather clock began chiming noon, its Westminster melody echoing through the lobby with haunting beauty. But now the timepiece seemed less like an innocent decoration and more like a monument to deception and hidden purposes. As the final chime faded, Murphy made one more revelation that would haunt Detective Kessler for the rest of his life. The most important thing you need to understand, detective, is that this case must never be officially solved. The Grand National Bank robbery will remain a cold case because national security requires it to remain a mystery. You will file a report indicating that unknown perpetrators conducted a sophisticated heist and escaped without a trace. Kessler felt the weight of secrets settling on his shoulders like a lead blanket. He had stumbled into a world where truth was a commodity to be managed rather than discovered, where justice was subordinated to national interests he could barely comprehend. And if I refused to participate in this cover-up? Murphy's smile was sad rather than threatening. Detective, you are a patriot who served your country in France. I'm confident you will do what's necessary to serve it again here at home. The old security guard began collecting the photographs and documents, preparing to seal them away once more. But before he closed the hidden panel, he handed Kessler a single photograph. This is the only evidence of this morning's events that you will be allowed to keep, Murphy said. Study it carefully, because it contains a truth that you will need to remember. The photograph showed the bank lobby during the height of the morning's confusion, but it had been taken from an impossible angle, directly above the scene, as if the camera had been positioned in the ceiling. In the image, Kessler could see himself, the supposed federal agents, the fake customers, and all the other participants in the elaborate deception. But there was something else in the photograph that made his blood run cold. In the shadows near the grandfather clock stood a figure that had not been visible to anyone in the lobby. A tall man in a dark coat, whose face was obscured, but whose presence suggested that even the intelligence operatives had been under surveillance by yet another layer of authority. "Who is that?" Kessler whispered, pointing to the shadowy figure. Murphy glanced at the photograph and his expression grew grave. "Detective, there are some questions that are too dangerous to answer. Some truths that are too complex for any one person to understand." The security guard sealed the hidden panel and returned to his chair near the entrance, once again assuming the appearance of a harmless elderly man. "Your report should indicate that approximately $50,000 in cash and negotiable securities were stolen by unknown perpetrators who used sophisticated techniques to avoid detection. The case will be assigned to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, where it will quietly disappear into their unsolved files." As Kessler prepared to leave the bank, Evangeline approached him with tears in her eyes. "Detective, my father is guilty of embezzlement, but he's not a traitor. Whatever else happened here this morning, please remember that he's just a weak man who made terrible choices, not an enemy of the state." Thaddeus Cromwell, still shaking from the morning's revelations, offered his own plea. "Detective, I have been drinking to forget what I have seen working in this bank. If you are filing a report, please remember that some of us were just trying to survive in a world we didn't understand." And Cornelius Ashworth, broken and defeated, made one final confession. "Detective Kessler, the money I embezzled was used to pay gambling debts to organized crime figures who threatened my family. Every crime I committed was an attempt to protect the people I love. That doesn't excuse what I did, but it might explain why a desperate man would make such terrible choices." As Detective Kessler walked out of the Grand National Bank at 12:30 p.m. on November 14, 1930, he carried with him secrets that would poison his sleep and haunt his dreams for the remainder of his life. The case that would officially remain unsolved was actually too solved, layer upon layer of truth and deception that created a puzzle too dangerous to complete. The grandfather clock continued marking time in the lobby, its Westminster chimes echoing through the marble halls like a funeral dirge for justice itself. And somewhere in the shadows of American intelligence operations, planners were already designing the next test of their increasingly sophisticated methods of controlling truth and managing reality. The mystery of the Grand National Bank robbery had become something far more sinister than a simple crime. It had become a window into a world where the line between protection and control had become so blurred that even the protectors could no longer see it clearly. 3 weeks after the incident, December 5th, Detective Raymond Kessler sat in his cramped apartment above Flanagan's Tavern, staring at the photograph Murphy had given him. The whiskey glass in his trembling hand was his fourth of the evening, but the alcohol did nothing to blur the haunting details of that impossible image. The shadow figure near the grandfather clock seemed to mock him from the faded print, a reminder that even in a world of endless deception, someone had been watching the watchers. 3 weeks had passed since the morning that had shattered his understanding of reality, and Kessler had dutifully filed the report exactly as instructed. Unknown perpetrators conducted sophisticated heist, approximately $50,000 stolen, case transferred to federal jurisdiction for investigation. The words had felt like poison in his mouth, but he had written them because Murphy was right. He was a patriot who had sworn to serve his country. But serving his country had come at a cost that was slowly destroying his sanity. The official investigation had lasted exactly 4 days before being quietly transferred to a federal task force that existed only on paper. No federal agents had ever contacted the St. Louis Police Department about the case. No follow-up reports had been filed. The Grand National Bank robbery had simply vanished into the bureaucratic maze of Washington, D.C., as if it had never happened at all, except for the dreams. Every night, Kessler relived those impossible moments when reality had shifted like quicksand beneath his feet. He saw Miss Fitzpatrick's transformation from elderly widow to sophisticated researcher, heard Agent Morrison's voice explaining operations that made no sense, felt the weight of secrets that were too dangerous to carry but too important to forget. But most disturbing of all were the dreams about the photograph itself. In his nightmares, Kessler found himself standing in that impossible position above the bank lobby, looking down at the chaos he had witnessed. And in those dreams, he could see the face of the shadow figure near the grandfather clock, a face that belonged to someone he recognized but had never met. The face belonged to himself. A knock at his apartment door interrupted Kessler's brooding. He wasn't expecting visitors, and given the nature of the secrets he carried, unexpected callers filled him with dread. But when he opened the door, he found Evangeline Ashworth standing in the hallway, her face pale and her eyes red from crying. "Miss Ashworth," he said, instinctively moving to block her view of the photograph on his table. "What brings you here at this hour?" "Detective, I need to tell you something that I couldn't say in front of Murphy," she whispered, glancing nervously toward the stairs. "May I come in?" Kessler hesitated, then stepped aside to allow her entry. Evangeline moved to his window and peered through the curtains at the street below, as if checking for surveillance. Her paranoia seemed justified when Kessler noticed a black automobile parked across the street, the same model Packard that had been used during the bank incident. "They are watching all of us," Evangeline said quietly. "Everyone who was in the bank that morning is under constant surveillance. My father, Mr. Cromwell, even Murphy himself. We are all prisoners of the secrets we witnessed." She turned from the window and her eyes fell on the photograph that Kessler had been studying. Her face went white as she recognized the impossible perspective of the image. "Where did you get this?" she demanded, her voice barely above a whisper. "Murphy gave it to me. He said it was the only evidence I'd be allowed to keep." Evangeline studied the photograph with an intensity that suggested she was seeing details that Kessler had missed. Her finger traced the outline of the shadow figure near the grandfather clock, and when she spoke, her voice carried a note of absolute terror. "Detective, this photograph wasn't taken on November 4th. The statement hit Kessler like a physical blow. "What do you mean?" "Look at the calendar on Cromwell's desk," she said, pointing to a barely visible detail in the background of the image. "It shows November 21st. This photograph was taken a week after the incident." Kessler grabbed a magnifying glass and studied the image more carefully. Evangeline was right. The calendar clearly showed a date that was impossible, but there was something else wrong with the photograph, something that made his blood run cold. "The people in this image," he said slowly, "they are in exactly the same positions they were in during the incident. Exactly the same poses, the same expressions, the same gestures. As if they were recreating the scene," Evangeline agreed, "or as if the entire incident was being repeated." The implications were staggering. Either the photograph had been doctored to show an impossible date, or the events of November 14th had been restaged a week later for purposes that neither of them could comprehend. But why would intelligence operatives repeat a complex deception that had already served its purpose? "There's something else," Evangeline continued, her voice growing even quieter. "My father received a letter yesterday. It was delivered by hand, with no return address, and it contained information that has driven him to the edge of complete breakdown." She reached into her purse and withdrew an envelope that bore no markings except Cornelius Ashworth's name written in elegant script. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a message that was both simple and terrifying. The performance was satisfactory. "Prepare for the next act. December 14th. Same time, same place, new audience." Kessler read the message 3 times before its full meaning sank in. They are going to do it again? It appears so. But this time, they want different witnesses, different participants. My father has been instructed to select new employees, arrange for different customers to be present, and ensure that a different police officer responds to the incident. The pattern was becoming clear, and it was more horrifying than anything Kessler had imagined. The Grand National Bank wasn't just a front for intelligence operations. It was a training ground where complex deception scenarios were practiced and perfected. The events of November 14th hadn't been a one-time operation. They were part of an ongoing program designed to test and refine techniques for controlling reality and manipulating truth. "How many times do you think they have done this?" Kessler asked, though he dreaded the answer. "I have been researching the bank's history," Evangeline replied. "Every few months for the past 3 years, there have been minor incidents that required police response. Small thefts, disturbances, suspicious activities. Each time a different officer responded, filed a report, and then the case quietly disappeared into federal jurisdiction." She pulled out a notebook filled with dates, names, and details that painted a picture of systematic manipulation spanning years. Detective Morrison, Dr. Harrington, even Patterson. They are not real people. They are roles played by different actors depending on the specific scenario being tested. Kessler felt his worldview crumbling once again. And Murphy is real, but he's not just a security guard. Based on what I have been able to discover, he's a senior intelligence official who oversees training operations throughout the Midwest. The Grand National Bank is just one of several institutions he uses for these exercises. The scope of the deception was overwhelming. An entire infrastructure of fake identities, controlled scenarios, and manipulated law enforcement responses had been operating under their noses for years. How many other unsolved mysteries were actually training exercises? How many crimes that had baffled investigators were simply tests of intelligence capabilities? But even as these revelations sank in, Kessler realized that Evangeline's visit wasn't just about sharing information. She was here because she needed his help with something specific. "What do you want me to do?" he asked. "I want you to help me stop them," she said, her voice carrying a determination that reminded him of her father's commanding presence. "The December 14th exercise is going to involve innocent people who have no idea they are being manipulated. Real customers, real employees, a real police officer who will have his entire understanding of reality shattered just like yours was. And how exactly do you propose we stop a government intelligence operation?" Evangeline smiled grimly. "By giving them exactly what they want, but not in the way they expect it." December 14th, 1930. The morning was overcast and bitterly cold, with snow threatening to fall before noon. Detective Kessler stood across the street from the Grand National Bank, watching as the new cast of characters took their positions for what he now understood was a carefully choreographed performance. But this time, things would be different. Evangeline had spent the past week implementing a plan that was as audacious as it was dangerous. Instead of allowing the intelligence operatives to control every aspect of the scenario, She had introduced variables that they couldn't predict or manage. The innocent customers entering the bank this morning included 3 genuine federal agents who had been convinced that they were investigating a real criminal conspiracy. The robbery suspects were actually undercover police officers who believed they were participating in a joint federal task force operation, and the police officer who would respond to the incident was Detective William Morrison, no relation to the fake agent Morrison from November, who had been briefed on what he thought was a legitimate sting operation. Most importantly, hidden throughout the bank were recording devices that would capture every moment of the deception for posterity. If the intelligence operatives wanted to test their reality manipulation techniques, they would do so knowing that their methods were being documented by people they couldn't control. At exactly 10:47 a.m., the scenario began to unfold with the same precision Kessler had witnessed a month earlier. But this time he was watching from outside, where he could observe the whole performance without being trapped within its web of deception. 3 men in dark overcoats entered the bank through the front door. A clock repairman was already working on the grandfather clock in the lobby. Customers were positioned exactly where the script demanded. Even Murphy was in his usual chair near the entrance, ready to play his role as the wise old security guard who would reveal the truth at the crucial moment. But within minutes, it became clear that something was going wrong. The federal agents who were supposed to be playing victims recognized the supposed robbery suspects as police officers. The undercover police officers realized that the federal agents were actually investigating them. Detective Morrison burst through the front door, expecting to find a controlled sting operation, and instead discovered a scene of complete chaos as multiple law enforcement agencies tried to arrest each other. Through the bank's windows, Kessler could see Murphy rising from his chair with an expression of pure panic. The old intelligence official was watching his carefully controlled scenario disintegrate into exactly the kind of interagency conflict that intelligence operations were designed to avoid. But the real surprise came when the clock repairman, who was supposed to be playing the role of Jerome Patterson, removed his disguise and revealed himself to be the actual Jerome Patterson, the real former Mosler Safe Company employee who had been dismissed for stealing blueprints. Patterson had been recruited by Evangeline specifically because of his genuine expertise and his personal vendetta against the banking industry. Unlike the actors who usually played criminal roles in these exercises, Patterson was conducting an actual robbery while everyone else was participating in what they thought were various law enforcement operations. The irony was perfect and terrifying. In their attempt to create a controlled deception, the intelligence operatives had inadvertently provided cover for a real crime committed by someone with both the skills and motivation to pull it off successfully. Kessler watched as Patterson emerged from the vault area, carrying genuine valuables, while federal agents, police officers, and intelligence operatives continued their 3-way confrontation in the lobby. The real criminal was escaping in plain sight while the representatives of law and order arrested each other for crimes that weren't actually being committed. But Patterson's triumph was short-lived. As he approached the grandfather clock that had served as his cover, Murphy activated a mechanism that Kessler had never seen before. Gas began filling the lobby, not lethal but enough to incapacitate everyone present within minutes. One by one, the participants in the chaotic scene collapsed to the marble floor. Federal agents, police officers, intelligence operatives, and genuine criminal alike succumbed to the gas that Murphy had released from hidden dispensers throughout the bank. As the last person fell unconscious, teams of individuals in protective masks entered the bank and began the process of sorting out the aftermath. Some participants would wake up in hospital beds with memories of a gas leak accident. Others would find themselves in federal holding facilities with no clear understanding of how they had arrived there. A few might simply disappear entirely, their identities absorbed into the same intelligence apparatus that had created this elaborate deception. Kessler realized that he was witnessing the ultimate expression of reality control, the ability to literally erase an event from existence by ensuring that no witnesses remained who could provide coherent testimony about what had actually occurred. But Evangeline's hidden recording devices were still running, capturing every moment of the cleanup operation. For the first time in years of these exercises, there would be an independent record of the intelligence community's methods and capabilities. As Kessler watched the cleanup crews work with mechanical efficiency, he became aware of someone standing beside him. He turned to find Murphy, somehow having escaped the gas that had incapacitated everyone else in the bank. "Impressive planning, detective," the old man said, his voice carrying a note of genuine admiration. Miss Ashworth demonstrated considerable strategic thinking in her attempt to expose our operations. "You knew what she was planning? We have been monitoring all communications between the two of you since her visit to your apartment. Your conversations were quite illuminating regarding the psychological impact of exposure to classified operations." The revelation that they had been under surveillance confirmed Kessler's worst fears about the reach and sophistication of the intelligence apparatus. But it also raised a terrifying question about Evangeline's current whereabouts. "Where is she?" Murphy gestured toward a black sedan that was pulling away from the bank's rear entrance. "Miss Ashworth is being relocated to a position where her talents can be better utilized. Her demonstration of strategic thinking and operational planning has earned her an offer of employment with our organization. And if she refuses, detective, people with her level of knowledge about our operations don't refuse such offers. They accept them, or they experience accidents that prevent them from sharing that knowledge with unauthorized individuals." The casual mention of murder sent ice through Kessler's veins. He realized that he was probably the only person left alive who had witnessed both the November and December operations and retained clear memories of what had actually occurred. "What happens to me?" Murphy studied him with the calculating gaze of someone evaluating a complex problem. "That depends entirely on your willingness to continue serving your country's interests. We have a position available for someone with your particular combination of law enforcement experience and exposure to classified operations." The offer was a trap disguised as an opportunity, and Kessler knew that refusing would likely result in his own accident. But accepting would mean becoming part of the system that had manipulated his understanding of reality and destroyed his faith in the institutions he had sworn to protect. "What kind of position?" "You would become a handler for operations similar to what you have witnessed here. Your job would be to manage local law enforcement responses to training exercises and ensure that investigating officers reach appropriate conclusions about the events they observe." The irony was bitter and complete. Kessler was being offered the chance to become the next Murphy, a gatekeeper of secrets who would spend his life manipulating other police officers just as he had been manipulated. "I need time to consider your offer." "Of course, take all the time you need, detective, but remember that in our line of work, time is often the most limited resource available." 15 years later, November 4th, Detective Lieutenant Raymond Kessler stood in the lobby of the Grand National Bank, watching as a new generation of intelligence operatives prepared for another training exercise. The grandfather clock still stood in its place of honor, still chiming the Westminster melody that had become the soundtrack to his nightmares. 15 years of serving as Murphy's successor had aged him beyond his 54 years. His hair was completely white. His hands showed the tremor of a man who drank too much, and his eyes held the hollow look of someone who had seen too much truth and lost his ability to distinguish it from deception. The bank itself had changed little since 1930. New technology had been installed, more sophisticated recording equipment, improved gas delivery systems, and communication devices that connected the operation to intelligence centers across the country. But the fundamental purpose remained the same: training operatives in the art of reality manipulation and testing law enforcement response protocols. Kessler had overseen hundreds of exercises during his tenure, each one involving innocent police officers who would leave the experience fundamentally changed by their exposure to controlled deception. Some adapted and were recruited into the intelligence community. Others suffered psychological breaks that ended their careers. A few simply disappeared when they proved unable to accept the new reality that had been revealed to them. But today's exercise was different. Today, the subject was Detective William Brennan, the son of former Police Commissioner Harold Brennan, whose signature had appeared on some of the corruption documents Patterson had discovered in. The younger Brennan was being tested not just for his response to deception, but for his potential knowledge of his father's involvement in the intelligence operations that had been running since the night. As Kessler watched the familiar scenario begin to unfold, he thought about Evangeline Ashworth. She had indeed accepted employment with the intelligence community, and over the years had become one of their most effective operatives. Her talent for strategic planning and her understanding of psychological manipulation had made her invaluable for designing increasingly sophisticated training scenarios, but she had also used her position to create a hidden archive of information about the intelligence community's domestic operations, working with a small network of individuals who had been recruited under circumstances similar to Kessler's own. She had been documenting the full scope of reality manipulation programs for over a decade. The archive was insurance, evidence that could expose the intelligence community's methods if something happened to any of the people who possessed dangerous knowledge. But it was also a weapon that could bring down the entire apparatus if it ever fell into the wrong hands. Kessler carried one piece of that archive with him at all times, the original photograph Murphy had given him in 1930, along with dozens of similar images documenting exercises conducted at other locations throughout the country. The collection told the story of a shadow government that had been operating within American institutions for decades, manipulating reality to serve purposes that even its participants didn't fully understand. As the exercise in the bank reached its climax, Kessler made a decision that had been years in the making. Instead of following his usual script and guiding Detective Brennan toward the appropriate conclusions, he was going to tell him the truth. All of it. The truth about the intelligence operations, the reality manipulation programs, the systematic recruitment of law enforcement personnel, and the network of individuals who had been documenting these activities for future exposure. He was going to give Brennan the choice that he himself had never been offered, the chance to walk away with full knowledge of what he had witnessed. But as Kessler approached the young detective, he felt a sharp pain in his chest. The heart attack that felled him was sudden and massive, dropping him to the marble floor of the bank lobby, where he had spent 15 years of his life orchestrating deceptions. His last conscious thought was the realization that his death was not natural. Someone in the intelligence community had been monitoring his intentions, and they had taken steps to ensure that the truth he carried would die with him. Present day, November 4th. Dr. Patricia Chambers, a forensic psychiatrist specializing in cold cases, sat in her office at Washington University reviewing files that had been declassified after 95 years of secrecy. The Grand National Bank robbery of 1930 had officially been transferred from the unsolved to the historically significant category, allowing researchers to examine evidence that had been sealed for nearly a century. The file was massive, containing thousands of documents, photographs, and recordings that told a story almost too complex to believe. Intelligence operations, reality manipulation programs, systematic recruitment of law enforcement personnel, and evidence of a shadow government that had operated within American institutions for decades. But the most disturbing element of the file was the revelation that the robbery had never actually occurred. The Grand National Bank had been a training facility for intelligence operatives, and every unsolved mystery associated with it had been a carefully orchestrated exercise designed to test and refine techniques for controlling public perception of reality. The people who had disappeared on November 14, 1930, had not vanished mysteriously. They had simply returned to their real identities after completing their roles in a training scenario. The money that had supposedly been stolen had never existed. Even the victims and witnesses had been actors playing predetermined roles. The only real crime committed at the Grand National Bank had been the systematic deception of law enforcement officers and the manipulation of historical records to create false mysteries that would baffle investigators for generations. Dr. Chambers paused in her reading when she came across a photograph that had been labeled Evidence Item 1, Original Source Unknown. The image showed a man in his 50s standing in the lobby of the Grand National Bank, apparently observing a training exercise in progress. According to the file notes, the photograph had been found in the effects of Detective Raymond Kessler after his death in 19... But something about the photograph troubled Dr. Chambers. The man in the image looked familiar, though she couldn't immediately place where she might have seen him before. She enhanced the digital image and studied the figure more carefully. The realization, when it came, sent chills through her entire body. The man in the photograph was her own grandfather, Dr. Malcolm Chambers, who had worked for the federal government during the 1930s and 1940s in what she had always assumed was a routine administrative position. Dr. Chambers reached for her phone and dialed the number for the National Security Archive. If her grandfather had been involved in these operations, there might be other family members who possessed knowledge about the intelligence community's historical activities. But before she could complete the call, her office door opened and a man in a dark suit entered without being invited. "Dr. Chambers," he said, his voice carrying the calm authority of someone accustomed to compliance. "I believe you have been reviewing some files that require special handling." She looked at the identification he offered, which indicated that he was Agent Morrison with the Department of Homeland Security. The name sent another chill through her as she remembered reading about an Agent Morrison in the historical files. "We are going to need you to return those documents immediately," Morrison continued. "And we are going to need to discuss your future involvement in research activities that touch on matters of national security." Dr. Chambers realized that she was experiencing the same choice that had been offered to Detective Kessler nearly a century earlier. She could cooperate with the intelligence community and become part of their system, or she could resist and face consequences that she could only imagine. But unlike Kessler, she had been warned by the historical record of what cooperation actually meant. She knew that accepting their offer would mean spending her life perpetuating the same deceptions that had been manipulating American society for generations. "Agent Morrison," she said, reaching for the emergency alert button hidden beneath her desk. "I think you should know that these files have already been copied and distributed to several colleagues who specialize in government transparency issues." Morrison's expression didn't change, but she saw his hand move inside his coat. "Dr. Chambers, I hope you understand that sharing classified information with unauthorized individuals is a federal crime that carries severe penalties. And I hope you understand that the systematic manipulation of historical records and the intimidation of researchers is a crime against democracy itself." The confrontation that followed would never appear in any official records. Dr. Chambers would be found the next morning, apparently having suffered a heart attack while working late in her office. The files she had been reviewing would disappear, and her research into the Grand National Bank case would be dismissed as the obsession of an unstable academic who had been under stress due to personal problems. But the truth she had discovered would live on, hidden in the networks of researchers and activists who understood that some mysteries were deliberately created to conceal more dangerous truths. The Grand National Bank robbery would remain officially unsolved, not because the evidence was insufficient, but because solving it would expose a system of reality manipulation that had been operating at the heart of American government for over a century. And in secure facilities across the country, new generations of intelligence operatives would continue training in the techniques pioneered at the Grand National Bank, perfecting their ability to control public perception of truth and ensure that certain secrets would never be fully revealed. The grandfather clock still stands in the lobby of what was once the Grand National Bank, now converted to luxury condominiums. Every hour, its Westminster chimes echo through the marble halls, marking time for residents who have no idea that they are living above one of the most sophisticated deception operations in American history. But sometimes, late at night, visitors report hearing footsteps in the lobby when no one is there, and voices discussing plans that make no sense to anyone who overhears them. The building's security cameras occasionally capture images of figures in dark coats who appear for a few frames and then vanish, as if they exist only in the spaces between seconds. The mystery of the Grand National Bank robbery will never be solved, because it was never meant to be solved. It was designed to remain a puzzle, a distraction, that would keep investigators focused on finding answers to the wrong questions, while the real truth remained hidden in plain sight. And somewhere in the archives of American intelligence, planners are still designing new mysteries, new unsolved cases, new ways to ensure that the public never fully understands the difference between the reality they experience and the reality that is carefully constructed for them to experience. The greatest robbery in the history of the Grand National Bank was not the theft of money or securities. It was the theft of truth itself. From the personal journal of Agent Victoria Harrington, discovered in 2024 during the renovation of a government storage facility in Virginia, November 14, 1955, 25 years to the day since the first exercise at the Grand National Bank. I have spent a quarter-century perfecting the art of reality manipulation, and I have reached a conclusion that will probably result in my elimination. The training programs we developed were never intended to be temporary. They were designed to create a permanent infrastructure for controlling public perception of truth. Every unsolved mystery, every conspiracy theory, every cold case that captures public imagination is potentially a cover for operations that the American people are not supposed to understand. We told ourselves that we were protecting democracy by ensuring that certain truths remained hidden. But we were actually destroying democracy by making it impossible for citizens to distinguish between authentic reality and manufactured reality. The Grand National Bank was just the beginning. There are facilities like it in every major city in America, conducting exercises that test our ability to manipulate everything from criminal investigations to historical records to news reporting. We have become so skilled at controlling truth that we no longer remember what truth actually looks like. I am writing this journal as my confession and my warning. The intelligence community that claims to protect America has become the greatest threat to the American ideal of informed democracy. We have created a shadow government that operates through deception rather than authority, and we have trained generations of operatives who see reality manipulation as a legitimate tool of statecraft. If this journal is ever discovered, please remember that not all mysteries are meant to be solved. Some mysteries exist to prevent you from asking more dangerous questions about the people who created them. The Grand National Bank robbery was never solved because it was never real. But the conspiracy to control American reality is both real and ongoing, and that is a mystery that must be solved before it destroys the democracy it was supposedly created to protect. Agent Victoria Harrington was found dead in her Virginia home on November 15, 1955, apparently having suffered a heart attack. Her death was ruled natural by the local coroner, and no investigation was conducted. This journal was discovered 69 years later, hidden in a wall cavity during building renovations. The Grand National Bank robbery remains officially unsolved.